Imagine standing on the shore of Roman Britain on a cold autumn morning. Behind you, a stone fort still flies the eagle of Rome. Soldiers patrol its walls, merchants crowd the marketplace, and children play in streets that have known Roman rule for generations. At first glance, everything appears exactly as it always has. Yet something invisible has already begun. Ships are quietly leaving Britain's shores, carrying experienced Roman soldiers back across the Channel. Imperial officials disappear one by one. Messages from the emperor arrive less frequently. Taxes are no longer collected with the same authority. And the greatest empire the Western world had ever seen is slowly letting go of one of its most distant provinces. No one watching that ordinary morning could have imagined that within only a few generations an entirely new people would emerge from the uncertainty that followed. Not because strangers simply crossed the sea and replaced everyone who was already there, but because old identities slowly faded while entirely new ones were taking shape. For centuries, we have been told a remarkably simple story about what happened next. It appears in school textbooks, television documentaries, and countless history books. After Rome abandoned Britain, Germanic tribes known as the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes crossed the North Sea, conquered the native Britons, pushed them west into Wales and Cornwall, and founded what would eventually become England. It is one of the best-known origin stories in European history. It is dramatic, easy to understand, and it seems to explain almost everything. It tells us why English belongs to the Germanic family of languages, instead of descending from Latin. Why early English kingdoms carried names linked to peoples from Northern Europe, and why archaeologists discovered cemeteries filled with weapons, jewelry, and pottery closely resembling those found across the North Sea. For generations, the evidence appeared to point in one clear direction. If you're fascinated by Britain's hidden history, ancient DNA, forgotten kingdoms, and the discoveries that continue rewriting everything we thought we knew about our ancestors, then you're going to love what we uncover here on UK Bloodlines. Every week, we explore remarkable surnames, bloodlines, archaeology, and the real stories buried beneath centuries of history. If that sounds like your kind of documentary, take a moment to subscribe, because everything you've just heard is only half the story. Then scientists opened graves that had remained untouched for nearly 1,500 years. The people buried inside those graves had no political opinions, no interest in modern debates, and no idea that their remains would one day become central to one of Britain's biggest historical questions. Yet hidden inside their bones was something no medieval chronicler, no Victorian historian, and no 20th century archaeologist had ever been able to examine before. Ancient DNA. When researchers began comparing the genetic signatures of people buried in early medieval England with those of both earlier Romano-British communities and populations living across the North Sea, they expected straightforward answers. Instead, they uncovered something far more fascinating. Yes, migrants had crossed the sea. Yes, continental ancestry was clearly present in many communities. But alongside those newcomers were people whose ancestry stretched back into Britain long before the Anglo-Saxon period ever began. Some cemeteries contained families with remarkably different ancestral backgrounds buried side by side. Others revealed communities where migration had been extensive, while elsewhere continuity with Britain's earlier inhabitants remained surprisingly strong. Suddenly, one of the best-known stories in British history became far more complicated than anyone had imagined. The evidence suggested that the Anglo-Saxons did not simply replace the people already living in Britain. In many places, they lived alongside them, married into local communities, raised children together, and gradually created an entirely new society. The biggest surprise was not that migrants came to Britain. It was that the people who would eventually become the English may have inherited far more of Britain's earlier population than historians once believed. But that first discovery immediately raises an even bigger question. If the newcomers did not simply replace the native population, then who actually became the English? Was England created by conquest, by migration, by cultural transformation, or by something far more human than any single explanation could capture? Because if the latest evidence is pointing where many historians and geneticists now believe it is, then England was not born when one people simply replaced another. It was born when several different worlds collided, adapted, and slowly became something entirely new. To understand why that conclusion has transformed one of Britain's oldest historical debates, we first need to return to the Britain that existed before the first Anglo-Saxon kingdoms ever appeared. Imagine walking through Britain around the year AD 400. Roman roads stretch across the countryside with astonishing precision. Stone bridges carry travellers over rivers that once divided tribal territories. Villas surrounded by fertile farmland produce grain, wool, and wine for nearby markets. Public bathhouses still operate in many towns. Beautiful mosaics decorate the homes of wealthy landowners. Christianity is spreading across the province, while older beliefs continue quietly in the countryside. Latin is heard in administration and religion, while Brittonic languages remain the everyday speech of many ordinary families. This is not an isolated island at the edge of the known world. It is a province of an empire stretching from Britain to North Africa and the eastern Mediterranean. Yet beneath this appearance of stability, the foundations are already beginning to crack. Across Europe, Rome is fighting for survival. Civil wars, economic instability, political turmoil, and repeated invasions place enormous pressure on the empire's frontiers. Britain becomes increasingly difficult to defend, and around AD 410 Emperor Honorius is traditionally believed to have advised Britain's communities to organize their own defense. Historians continue to debate exactly what that message meant in practice, but there is broad agreement that Roman authority had weakened dramatically by the early 5th century. The legions did not disappear overnight, nor did Roman culture suddenly vanish. Many towns remained occupied, roads continued to be used, and farming communities carried on much as before. History rarely changes in one dramatic moment. More often, change arrives quietly. A market grows smaller, a fort receives fewer supplies, an official is never replaced, a road slowly falls into disrepair. The old system does not collapse all at once. It simply stops holding everything together. Imagine one Romano-British family living near Britain's eastern coastline. A father who once supplied grain to Roman soldiers notices fewer officials arriving to collect it. His son grows up hearing stories of the empire's former strength, but has never seen a full Roman legion march through the local town. His granddaughter will inherit a world where Rome has become little more than a distant memory. 3 generations. That is all it takes for one of history's greatest empires to fade into the past. But while Britain was looking inward, communities living across the North Sea were looking west. For centuries, people from what is now northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands had traded with Roman Britain. Archaeological discoveries show that these connections existed long before the migration period. Goods, ideas, technologies, and sometimes people crossed these waters regularly. The North Sea was never simply a barrier separating different worlds. It was one of Europe's busiest highways, carrying merchants, soldiers, craftsmen, families, and ideas between distant shores. As Roman authority weakened, those long-established connections became increasingly important. Some newcomers likely arrived as traders. Others almost certainly came as mercenaries hired by local British rulers seeking military support during uncertain times. Still others came searching for farmland, opportunity, or security in a changing political landscape. Exactly how many arrived remains one of the biggest debates in early medieval history. And that uncertainty matters because, for centuries, historians had only 3 kinds of evidence to answer it. They had written accounts, archaeological discoveries, and language. Each revealed part of the story, but none could reveal the whole picture. The written sources described dramatic invasions. Archaeology uncovered Germanic-style cemeteries and settlements. The spread of Old English appeared to confirm that a new people had transformed Britain. For generations, the evidence seemed almost impossible to challenge. Yet there was one question that none of those sources could answer. They could tell historians how people lived. They could not tell them who those people actually were. That answer would remain buried beneath English fields for another 1500 years, waiting for a science that had not yet been invented. Imagine, for a moment, that you are living on Britain's eastern coastline around the year AD 450. The Roman Empire has faded into memory. The stone roads remain, but fewer people travel them. Forts still stand, but many are no longer fully manned. The markets are smaller than they once were, and the certainty that Rome provided has disappeared. Across the North Sea, unfamiliar sails begin appearing more frequently on the horizon. Some belong to traders, others carry experienced warriors looking for work. A few transport entire families searching for new opportunities. None of them could possibly know that historians, archaeologists, and geneticists would spend the next 15 centuries arguing over exactly who they were and how profoundly they transformed Britain. Yet this is where one of England's greatest historical mysteries truly begins. For generations, historians relied on three main sources to reconstruct these events. The first was the written record. Authors such as Gildas, writing in the 6th century, described a Britain consumed by violence, political failure, and divine punishment. His purpose, however, was never to produce a neutral history. He was a preacher warning his audience about moral decline, using recent events to strengthen his religious message. A few centuries later, the Venerable Bede would build a far more detailed narrative describing the arrival of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, identifying them as the peoples who laid the foundations of England. Bede remains one of the most important historians of early medieval Britain, but even he was writing generations after many of the events he described, relying on traditions, earlier sources, and the political realities of his own age. Later still, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle presented an even more complete origin story, one that medieval kingdoms used to explain where they had come from and why they deserved to rule. These texts are invaluable, but like every historical source, they must be read carefully. They are interpretations of the past, not recordings of it. The second source was archaeology. Across eastern and southern England, excavations uncovered cemeteries unlike those from Roman Britain. Men were buried with beautifully crafted swords, shields, and spears. Women wore elaborate brooches, necklaces, and glass beads whose designs closely resembled objects found in northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. Pottery styles, building techniques, and settlement patterns also appeared to reflect strong connections with communities across the North Sea. For decades, this seemed to confirm the traditional narrative. Here, at last, was the physical evidence of the Anglo-Saxons arriving in Britain. Yet archaeology has always presented one important challenge. Material culture does not necessarily equal ancestry. A finely crafted brooch can be traded, a sword may be inherited. A burial custom can be adopted because it carries prestige or political meaning, other than because every member of the community shares the same family origins. Objects reveal culture. They do not always reveal bloodlines. The third source was language, and perhaps no evidence seemed more convincing. By the 7th century, Old English had become the dominant language across much of what would become England. Place names reflected Germanic speech. Royal courts used it, laws were written in it. Over time it almost completely replaced the Brittonic languages across much of lowland England. For many historians, this linguistic transformation appeared impossible without an equally dramatic population replacement. After all, how else could an entirely new language spread so thoroughly? It seemed logical to conclude that a very large number of migrants must have arrived, overwhelming the native population, both culturally and demographically. For centuries, those three forms of evidence appeared to support one another so neatly that few questioned the larger picture. But history has a habit of becoming more complicated whenever new evidence appears. During the late 20th and early 21st centuries, advances in genetics transformed archaeology in ways no previous generation could have imagined. For the first time, scientists developed techniques capable of extracting ancient DNA from human remains that had lain buried for more than 1,000 years. Suddenly, historians were no longer limited to asking what chroniclers believed or what artifacts people carried into their graves. They could begin asking a far more intimate question. Who were these people, biologically speaking? Where had their ancestors actually come from? Imagine standing in a modern genetics laboratory. Inside carefully controlled rooms, researchers wearing protective clothing examine tiny fragments of ancient bone, often taken from the dense inner portion of the petrous bone behind the ear, because it preserves DNA exceptionally well. Every sample is treated with extraordinary care to avoid contamination. Powerful sequencing machines read genetic information preserved since the early Middle Ages. Computers then compare those genetic signatures with thousands of ancient individuals recovered from Britain and continental Europe. It is painstaking work that combines archaeology, genetics, statistics, and history into one extraordinary investigation. The graves themselves remain silent, yet the DNA they contain begins answering questions that written records never could. When the first large studies emerged, many researchers expected them simply to confirm what historians had long suspected. In part, they did. There was clear evidence that migrants from regions bordering the North Sea had settled in post-Roman Britain. Individuals buried in early Anglo-Saxon cemeteries often displayed strong genetic similarities to populations living in what is now northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. Migration was undeniably real. That much was never seriously in doubt. But almost immediately another pattern began to emerge, one that proved far more surprising. Not every cemetery looked the same. Not every region told the same story. In some parts of eastern England, continental ancestry appeared remarkably high, yet elsewhere, individuals buried with unmistakably Anglo-Saxon grave goods showed far greater continuity with Britain's earlier Romano-British population than anyone had expected. Sometimes to individuals buried only a few meters apart, participating in the same burial traditions and living within the same community, possessed noticeably different ancestral backgrounds. One person's family may have arrived only a generation or two earlier from across the North Sea, while another's ancestry reached deep into Roman and even Iron Age Britain. Yet both belonged to the same society. This was the moment when the old narrative began to fracture. The question could no longer be reduced to whether migrants replaced the native population. The evidence simply refused to support such a straightforward answer. Instead, England appeared to have emerged through a process of regional variation, migration, intermarriage, cultural adaptation, and gradual transformation. In some communities, newcomers may indeed have formed a substantial proportion of the population. In others, relatively smaller groups may have exercised cultural or political influence far beyond their actual numbers. Elsewhere, long-established British communities continued living on, gradually adopting new languages, customs, and identities, while remaining biologically connected to the people who had occupied Britain for centuries before Rome ever arrived. Rather than revealing one simple event, the DNA pointed towards hundreds of local stories unfolding simultaneously across a changing landscape. That discovery forces us to ask a question historians rarely considered a generation ago. What exactly made someone Anglo-Saxon? Was it ancestry? Was it language? Was it political allegiance? Was it the style of brooch they wore, the laws they followed, the king they served, or the stories they told their children? Modern research increasingly suggests that identity in post-Roman Britain was far more flexible than later generations imagined. A person could participate fully in Anglo-Saxon culture without descending entirely from continental migrants. Equally, someone with recent ancestry from across the North Sea could quickly become part of a mixed local community where identities were already blending together. Instead of rigid ethnic categories, we begin to see something far more recognizable: human societies adapting to extraordinary change. That may be the greatest revelation hidden inside the bones of early medieval England. The birth of England was not simply the arrival of one people. It was the gradual creation of an entirely new society, built from migration, survival, cooperation, conflict, and countless ordinary families who never realized they were becoming the ancestors of a future nation. And remarkably, this is only the beginning of what the evidence reveals. One of the biggest mistakes we can make when looking at ancient DNA is asking it to answer questions it was never designed to answer. DNA can tell us where a person's ancestors most likely came from. It can reveal patterns of migration, population continuity, and biological relationships stretching back thousands of years. But it cannot tell us what language someone spoke, what stories they believed, which king they followed, or how they understood their own identity. A skeleton cannot tell us whether the child buried beneath it grew up calling himself a Briton, a Saxon, an Anglo, or something else entirely. Identity is cultural as much as biological, and culture often changes much faster than ancestry. That distinction may sound subtle, but it lies at the heart of one of the greatest misunderstandings surrounding the origins of England. Imagine a young girl living somewhere in eastern Britain around the year AD 520. Her father's family may have crossed the North Sea a generation earlier, bringing with them customs, jewelry, and a Germanic language. Her mother's family may have lived in Britain for centuries, tracing their ancestry back through Roman Britain, and perhaps even into the Iron Age. At home, she grows up speaking Old English, because it has become the language of opportunity. Her neighbours bury their dead according to customs that archaeologists will later describe as Anglo-Saxon. She knows nothing of future historians or modern DNA laboratories. She simply knows the world into which she was born. If we were somehow able to ask her who she was, would she answer, "I am Anglo-Saxon," or would she identify herself by her village, her family, or the local king she served? The truth is we cannot know. Yet thousands of people like her almost certainly existed, quietly living through one of Britain's greatest periods of transformation. This is why the latest research has become so important. It reminds us that ancestry and identity do not always move together. Archaeologists have discovered cemeteries where individuals buried according to Anglo-Saxon customs display remarkably different genetic backgrounds. Some carried a high proportion of ancestry to continental Europe. Others were far more closely related to Britain's earlier inhabitants. Yet they were buried side by side, often with similar grave goods, suggesting they belonged to the same communities and participated in the same cultural world. In other words, becoming part of Anglo-Saxon England did not necessarily require every family to share exactly the same biological origins. Communities were already blending together, and within only a few generations, those distinctions may have mattered far less to the people living there than they do to us today. That discovery helps explain another long-standing mystery. If the incoming migrants did not completely replace the local population across most of England, how did Old English become so dominant? For many years, historians assumed that only overwhelming numbers could explain such a dramatic linguistic shift. Yet history offers many examples where languages spread through influence rather than simple population replacement. Latin became the language of administration across much of Europe without replacing every local population. French became the language of England's ruling elite after the Norman conquest, despite relatively few Norman settlers. Spanish spread across much of the Americas through complex processes involving colonization, political authority, religion, education, and cultural change. Language often follows power, opportunity, and social advantage, just as much as ancestry. Now imagine Britain not as a peaceful country gradually receiving immigrants, but as a landscape recovering from imperial collapse. Roman institutions have weakened, regional rulers compete for influence. Communities seek protection wherever they can find it. In such a world, alliances become essential. Military service creates new opportunities. Marriage links families from different backgrounds. Trade connects distant settlements. New leaders reward loyalty regardless of ancestry. Under those conditions, adopting the language of successful newcomers may have brought practical advantages. Speaking Old English could open doors to political influence, trade, or military advancement. Children growing up in mixed communities may have naturally adopted the language spoken by local elites, even if one side of their family had lived in Britain for countless generations. Cultural transformation can sometimes happen far more or quickly than biological replacement. This also helps us understand why the archaeological evidence sometimes appears more Germanic than the genetic evidence alone would predict. Material culture often reflects aspiration as much as ancestry. A locally born family might choose continental jewelry because it represented status within their community. A warrior could carry a sword made in one region while descending from ancestors who had never left Britain. A burial rite could spread because respected leaders adopted it first. None of these choices required entire populations to be replaced. They required only that ideas, fashions, and political influence spread successfully through a changing society. Archaeology and genetics therefore complement one another rather than compete. Together they tell a richer story than either could tell alone. Perhaps nowhere is this clearer than at sites such as Oakington in Cambridgeshire, where researchers combined archaeological evidence with ancient DNA to examine an early Anglo-Saxon community in remarkable detail. The results revealed individuals with differing ancestral backgrounds living within the same settlement, sharing similar burial traditions, despite their varied origins. Studies like these have become increasingly important because they move the debate beyond sweeping national narratives and into the lives of real communities. Instead of asking whether the Anglo-Saxons replaced the Britons everywhere, historians now ask far more productive questions. What happened in this valley, this village, this cemetery, this family? The answers often differ from one location to another, reminding us that England was never created by a single event unfolding identically across the entire country. As more cemeteries have been studied, another important pattern has emerged. Regional variation appears to have been one of the defining features of early medieval England. In counties such as Norfolk, Suffolk, and Lincolnshire, continental ancestry often appears stronger than in many western regions. Elsewhere, continuity with earlier British populations is much more pronounced. This makes perfect sense when we remember Britain's geography. Communities along the eastern coastline maintained closer contact with the North Sea world and would naturally have experienced greater migration than more distant inland or western areas. Rather than imagining one enormous wave sweeping uniformly across the island, historians increasingly picture numerous migrations occurring at different times, involving different groups, and producing different outcomes, depending on local circumstances. England was not transformed in a single generation. It evolved community by community, kingdom by kingdom, family by family. That idea may not satisfy those looking for simple answers, but history rarely rewards simplicity for very long. The closer we examine the evidence, the more we encounter variation instead of uniformity, adaptation instead of rigid categories, and human experience instead of mythology. The old question asked whether the Anglo-Saxons replaced the Britons. The newer question is far more interesting. How did migrants and existing communities together create an entirely new society that eventually became England? Once we ask that question, the evidence begins fitting together far more naturally. Migration mattered, local continuity mattered, political power mattered, language mattered, intermarriage mattered. None of these explanations cancels the others. Together they reveal one of the most remarkable periods of cultural transformation in British history. And yet, the greatest surprise may still lie ahead. Because once we begin questioning how England itself emerged, another even deeper question follows almost immediately. If the English were created through centuries of migration, mixture, and adaptation, was that unique to England, or is that simply how nearly every nation in history has been formed? That question takes us beyond Britain and forces us to reconsider something much larger than the Anglo-Saxons themselves. It challenges the way we think about nations, ancestry, and identity across the entire human story. The deeper historians investigate the birth of England, the more they realize that this story is not only about the Anglo-Saxons. It is about something far more universal. It is about how nations are formed. Modern countries often imagine their origins as if they began with a single people, a single migration, or a single defining moment. We like stories with clear beginnings because they make identity feel stable. They tell us where we came from and who our ancestors were. But history rarely unfolds so neatly. More often, nations emerge gradually, shaped by centuries of migration, adaptation, conflict, cooperation, and countless ordinary people making practical decisions about how to survive the world around them. England appears to be no exception. The latest evidence suggests that it was not born fully formed through one dramatic invasion. It emerged through generations of interaction between communities whose lives became increasingly intertwined until entirely new identities took shape. Imagine standing in a small settlement somewhere in eastern England around the year AD 600. The village looks peaceful. Children chase one another between timber houses. Blacksmiths shape iron tools, while farmers prepare for another harvest. A traveller arriving from another kingdom would probably hear Old English spoken in the marketplace, yet beneath that shared language there's a remarkable diversity of family histories. One household may trace its ancestry almost entirely to migrants who crossed the North Sea 2 or 3 generations earlier. Another may descend largely from Romano-British families who never left the island. Their children play together without giving the matter a second thought. They marry one another. They worship together. They defend the same settlement. To them, What matters is not where every ancestor originated centuries before, but who belongs to their community now. Without realizing it, they are creating something entirely new. They are becoming the first generations who future historians will simply call English. This is where the old replacement model begins to lose its explanatory power. It encourages us to imagine two separate groups standing on opposite sides of history, one disappearing while the other takes its place. The archaeological and genetic evidence paints a much more dynamic picture. Communities were constantly changing. Some villages experienced significant immigration, while others remained dominated by families whose roots stretched back into Roman Britain and beyond. Political alliances shifted. Local rulers rose and fell. Trade routes evolved. Religious beliefs spread. Languages changed. The landscape itself remained familiar, but almost everything else was emotion. Rather than replacing one society with another overnight, post-Roman Britain appears to have experienced a long period during which old and new identities existed side by side before gradually blending into something neither side could have predicted. One of the most revealing lessons from recent genetic research is that ancestry itself varies enormously across England. There is no single genetic profile that represents every early medieval community. Instead, researchers consistently find regional diversity. Eastern counties often display stronger evidence of continental ancestry than western regions. Some settlements reveal extensive mixing within only a few generations, while others appear to have maintained greater continuity with Britain's earlier populations. This regional variation is exactly what historians might expect in a landscape shaped by multiple migrations occurring over many decades rather than one overwhelming invasion. Different communities experienced different histories. Geography mattered, politics mattered, opportunity mattered, human decisions mattered. Imagine trying to describe modern Britain using only one village. It would be impossible. No single community could represent London, Cornwall, Yorkshire, Norfolk, and the Scottish borders all at once. The same principle applies to early medieval England. For too long, historians searched for one simple explanation, capable of describing the entire country. Ancient DNA has instead revealed hundreds of local stories. Every cemetery contributes another piece of the puzzle. Every excavation reminds us that history unfolded differently from one valley to the next. Rather than weakening our understanding, this complexity makes the evidence more convincing. Real history almost always resists easy generalizations. This is also why archaeologists increasingly prefer to combine multiple disciplines instead of relying on one source of evidence alone. Ancient DNA tells us about ancestry. Archaeology reveals material culture and patterns of daily life. Linguistics explains how languages spread and evolved. Written sources preserve memories, traditions, and political narratives, even when they must be interpreted cautiously. None of these disciplines possesses every answer by itself. But when their findings overlap, they create one of the clearest pictures we have ever possessed of Britain's transition from a Roman province into a collection of early English kingdoms. Perhaps the most important lesson concerns identity itself. Modern discussions often assume that identity must be fixed and inherited, as though people have always belonged permanently to clearly defined ethnic groups. Yet early medieval Britain appears to tell a different story. Identity could change within a lifetime. A child growing up in a mixed community might speak a different language from their grandparents. A family could adopt new customs while preserving older traditions at home. Military service, marriage, religion, trade, and political loyalty all influenced how people understood themselves. Becoming Anglo-Saxon may not have required abandoning every aspect of Britain's earlier past. Instead, it may have involved participating in a new social and political world that gradually absorbed people from remarkably diverse backgrounds. That possibility explains why the phrase the Anglo-Saxons can sometimes mislead modern audiences. It sounds as though it describes one clearly defined biological population arriving fully formed from continental Europe. The reality was almost certainly far more fluid. Even the groups later labelled Angles, Saxons, and Jutes were themselves part of a wider North Sea world characterized by movement, trade, shifting alliances, and cultural exchange. Their own identities were probably less rigid than later historians imagined. By the time these communities settled in Britain, intermarried with local populations, and established new kingdoms, those identities continued evolving. England was not created by preserving ancient categories unchanged. It was created because those categories gradually transformed. The remarkable thing that science has not destroyed the old story. It has refined it. The migration happened. Archaeology confirms it. Written sources preserve memories of it. Genetics demonstrates that many migrants truly did settle in post-Roman Britain. What has changed is our understanding of scale, variation, and consequence. The evidence no longer supports the idea of a single uniform replacement affecting every corner of England in exactly the same way. Instead, it reveals a landscape where migration interacted with surviving local populations to produce something entirely new. That distinction may appear subtle, but it changes the entire narrative. England was not built by one people acting alone. It emerged through the interaction of many different communities, adapting to extraordinary historical circumstances. As historians often remind us, the most important discoveries are not always those that overturn everything we thought we knew. Sometimes the greatest breakthroughs come from replacing an overly simple explanation with one that better reflects the complexity of real human lives. Ancient DNA has done precisely that. It has not erased the Anglo-Saxons from history. It has placed them back into a much larger story, one that includes the Romano-British communities who remained, the migrants who crossed the North Sea, the mixed families who bridged both worlds, and the generations of children who inherited a future none of their ancestors could have imagined. By now, another question naturally begins to emerge. If England was created through migration, continuity, and cultural transformation all at once, why did later generations remember its origins as something much simpler? Why did medieval writers, Victorian historians, and even many 20th century textbooks favor a story of clear conquest rather than gradual transformation? To answer that, we need to explore how myths are created, why nations often simplify their own beginnings, and why modern science has forced historians to revisit some of Britain's oldest assumptions. And perhaps, by understanding how those myths were shaped, we may finally understand why this debate remains so important even today. So why did the simpler story survive for so long? The answer tells us as much about the historians who wrote Britain's past as it does about the people who actually lived it. Every generation interprets history through the questions that matter to its own time. Medieval writers wanted to explain the legitimacy of kings and kingdoms. Victorian historians, writing during the height of the British Empire, often preferred clear narratives of conquest, expansion, and nation-building. The idea that one energetic people had swept aside another and created England appealed to a society that valued decisive historical turning points. It was an elegant story, easy to understand, easy to teach, easy to remember. The problem was not that it was entirely wrong. The problem was that it was incomplete. Modern archaeology, genetics, and historical research have not erased the Anglo-Saxons from Britain's story. If anything, they have made their story even more remarkable. We now know that migration across the North Sea was real. Communities from what is now northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands genuinely settled in post-Roman Britain. Their languages transformed the future of England. Their political institutions shaped emerging kingdoms. Their customs influenced everyday life. Without them, England would never have developed into the nation we recognize today. But they were not building that future alone. They encountered people already living in Britain, communities whose ancestors had survived the Roman occupation, whose roots stretched back into the Iron Age, and whose lives continued despite the collapse of imperial rule. Over time these worlds met, sometimes peacefully, sometimes violently, sometimes through marriage, trade, shared labor, or political necessity. The result was not the disappearance of one people beneath another. It was the creation of something entirely new. That is perhaps the most important lesson hidden inside the ancient DNA. History is not a story of neatly separated peoples, taking turns to occupy the same island. It is a story of connection. Every generation inherits something from those who came before, while adding something of its own. The English language itself reflects that process. At its foundation lies Old English, brought by migrants from across the North Sea. Yet over the centuries, it absorbed thousands of words from Latin, Old Norse, Norman French, Celtic languages, and countless others. The language became stronger not because it remained unchanged, but because it adapted. The same may be said of England itself. Imagine once more that little girl we met earlier. Growing up around the year AD 520, her father may have traced his ancestry across the North Sea. Her mother may have descended from families who had lived in Britain since long before Rome. She grows up speaking Old English, hears Christian prayers, walks along Roman roads, and farms land first cultivated generations before she was born. She does not see herself as living through one of history's greatest transitions. She is simply living her life. She will marry, raise children, and eventually be buried in a cemetery that archaeologists may excavate 1500 years later. Her descendants will never know her name, but millions of people alive today unknowingly carry fragments of her ancestry. That is what makes ancient DNA so extraordinary. It does not merely tell us where people came from. It reminds us that every historical label we use, Roman, Briton, Anglo-Saxon, Jute, Viking, Norman, describes real human beings whose lives were infinitely more complicated than the categories we later created for them. Their identities shifted as the world around them changed. They adapted because survival demanded it. They built families across cultural boundaries. They adopted new languages while preserving older traditions. They created communities that would eventually become kingdoms, and kingdoms that would eventually become nations. Perhaps that is why the latest research has captured so much public attention. It challenges a comforting assumption that history moves in straight lines. Instead, it reveals something far more familiar. Human beings have always moved. They have always exchanged ideas. They have always married across communities. They have always adapted to changing political realities. Britain was never isolated from Europe. Throughout prehistory, the Roman period, the early Middle Ages, the Viking Age, and beyond, the island remained connected to the wider world. The people we now call Anglo-Saxons were one chapter in that much longer story, not its beginning and certainly not its end. None of this diminishes England's history. On the contrary, it makes that history richer. It replaces a single dramatic invasion with a far more remarkable process of transformation. It reveals ordinary people making extraordinary decisions in uncertain times. Farmers rebuilding after the collapse of empire. Craftsmen introducing new techniques. Children growing up in bilingual communities. Local leaders forging new alliances. Families from different backgrounds creating futures together. Those are not small details. They are the foundation upon which every later chapter of English history would be built. Today, whenever someone sends off a DNA sample hoping to discover their ancestry, they often expect simple answers. Perhaps they hope to find an Anglo-Saxon ancestor, a Viking connection, or evidence of Celtic origins. Modern genetic testing can certainly reveal fascinating patterns about deep ancestry, but it also reminds us that no individual is defined by a single historical population. Our family trees branch in countless directions. Every generation doubles the number of ancestors behind us. Travel back only 1,000 years, and the number becomes almost impossible to imagine. Somewhere among those countless lives are farmers, merchants, soldiers, monks, blacksmiths, mothers, children, newcomers, and families who had lived in Britain for centuries. The story of England belongs to all of them. So, were the Anglo-Saxons ever just English? The evidence increasingly suggests the question itself may be too simple. The people who built early England emerged from a world where migration, continuity, cultural change, and human adaptation were happening simultaneously. They were not one isolated population creating a nation from nothing. They were participants in a remarkable transformation that drew together the surviving Romano-British population, migrants from across the North Sea, and generations of families whose lives bridged both worlds. England was not born in a single moment. It was shaped over centuries by ordinary people who never realized they were creating a new identity. That may be the greatest revelation of all. The ancient bones uncovered beneath English fields did not expose a forgotten empire or a lost civilization. They revealed something far more powerful. They revealed that history is rarely about one people replacing another. More often, it is about human beings finding ways to live together, adapt together, and build something their ancestors could never have imagined. The English were not simply the descendants of the Anglo-Saxons. They were the descendants of everyone who helped shape Britain during one of the most transformative periods in its history. If this documentary changed the way you think about the origins of England, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think ancient DNA has fundamentally changed our understanding of British history, or has it simply added new layers to a story we were only beginning to understand? Share your perspective in the comments below, because some of the best discussions on UK bloodlines happen there. And if you enjoy evidence-based documentaries that uncover Britain's forgotten history, ancient DNA, remarkable surnames, hidden ancestry, and the real stories behind the people who shaped these islands, make sure you subscribe to UK Bloodlines and turn on notifications so you never miss our next documentary. Until next time, remember that every surname, every family tree, and every genome carries echoes of people whose lives still shape the world we live in today. History is not locked away in museums or buried beneath ancient fields. In many ways, it is still alive within all of us.